and it says 4 minutes.
Oh, really?
Oh,
Oh, no, there we are.
we're live.
2,554.
Wow, that is a lot of people.
Yeah. Why don't you start by sharing your screen so we're not just like staring?
Okay.
There we go.
Oh, I see a question in the chat room. I think people are starting to get in.
Yeah. So hi everybody who's here already. It normally takes a while for people to just sort of get into the room, so we'll wait a couple of minutes before we start. Yes, we will be recording this.
Yeah. But it's also going to be good live, right? So you stay on live, you'll be able to ask questions. Not an opportunity you get every day. It's not an opportunity I get every day to ask Tommy questions. So please stay on live.
Hi, guys.
Cool. So people are starting to let us know. Say hello in the chat box. Let us know where you're coming from. From Australia. Wow, that's amazing. Can't believe this is working. 2,500 people on today. I can't believe it. A little bit nervous. Nashville, Tennessee. Very cool. New Zealand. Wow, now I can't even keep up. The chats are coming in so fast I can't keep up. Japan, New Jersey, Florida.
We're missing
Houston,
Europe.
Texas.
Most of Europe should be asleep.
Yeah, sorry, Europe. If you're watching the recording, I apologize. We'll do another webinar earlier in the day for you. We're on the west coast of the US, which is specific time zone. So we're at one of the very last time zones. So we're late. But Romania, wow, holy cow, I can't believe it. This is amazing.
Oh, somebody's awake in Portugal. Hi.
Yeah, you need to go to bed in Portugal.
And Germany. And Germany. Hello.
Yeah. Sleep loss is bad for us. Everybody say. I hope you got. At the very least, you must have your blue blocking glasses on.
Yeah.
F. Lark.
Computer.
Yeah, Maryland. In Ireland, and it's midnight. Oh no, I'm sorry, Mark.
All right, I think we've reached a kind of a steady state. So maybe we should get going.
Yeah, we'll get going. Hi everyone, my name's Christopher Kelly. Do you remember me from the Keto Summit? I was the one doing the interviews. And I've got with me Dr. Tommy Wood, who was my co-conspirator. And today we've got a short presentation for you. We're going to leave plenty of time for questions and answers. I think we're in a really special place right now where, not only does Tommy do a lot of research and we work with a lot of people that do research into the ketogenic diet, but we've also worked with 1,000 athletes now at this time. And many of those athletes, if not all of them, are eating some form of high-fat diet. So we've seen a lot of stuff. And not only that, we've also collected an awful lot of data. Like every single athlete that's been through our door has done at least a basic blood chemistry, and in many cases, 5 or even 10 advanced functional medicine tests. So we have a ton of data that we would love to share with you so you can get some insight into what may or may not happen whilst you're eating a ketogenic diet. But maybe before I get into that, though, I should explain why it is that I'm doing this in the first place, because it's not an obvious progression for a computer programmer to be stood in front of 2,500 people talking about the ketogenic diet. And, I used to be a wreck of a human being back in my high carb days. So back about 2012, I'd say, was really the height of my awfulness. And at that time, I used to consume multi-injection gels, hand over fist, on very long bike rides in an attempt to be a better athlete. And I guess I succeeded. Like, I was pretty good on the bike. And my goal at that time was to upgrade from being a category 1 mountain biker to a pro. I wanted to get my pro license, and everything was going okay on the bike, but off the bike, I was just falling to pieces. So I had a lot of gas, I had a lot of bloating, I had diarrhea, I had brain fog, insomnia, zero sex drive and just a crazy number of symptoms. And so I did what anyone would do. And I went to my primary care doctor, who was just utterly useless. And the primary care doctor referred me to a gastroenterologist. And the gastroenterologist was worse than useless, because she suggested that my problems were nothing to do with the food that I was eating, and that I should take some steroid anti-inflammatory drugs. And she would put a camera down the top and up the bottom, and she would confirm what I've already told her. And then eventually, once the steroid anti-inflammatory drugs stopped working, then there would be surgery for me. And I was lucky enough to meet a woman who is now my wife, and she just finished a master's degree in food science. And she said, you should do an elimination diet before you do any of that. And I'm like, are you sure? And she said, yes, I'm sure. And so I did an elimination diet, and it worked wonders for me. And it worked wonders not just in terms of my symptoms, but also in some of the markers that we're going to be showing you today in the presentation. Some blood chemistry markers like high sensitivity C-reactive protein. So got fantastic results with changing my diet. And then later on, I learned about functional medicine and some of the other chronic underlying root causes of my problems. And when I fixed those problems, the transformation was so incredible, I decided that I really must see if there were other endurance athletes that had been affected by this. And so I started testing friends and family, and that progressed. And here we are now, 3 years later. I've quit my job at a hedge fund nearly 3 years ago, and we've worked with 1,000 athletes. And along the way, I've met some truly wonderful people, including Tommy, Emilia Luca, who's my #1 employee, some really incredible people. And I don't want other athletes to fall into the same trap that I did, where, you know, the doctors, they're looking at you and saying, oh, you look fine, you're a really healthy guy. And, you know, really you're not, you know, that they've got a waiting room full of sick people. That's what they're thinking. You know, I spent a couple of years eating a ketogenic diet, and I feel like I learned a lot of stuff from that. And a lot of that stuff came with Tommy's help. So maybe we can communicate some of that now. Tell me about, you know, how you got into this and your interest in the ketogenic diet, Tommy.
Yeah, sure. So if people read one of the emails that went out, I gave sort of a brief history about myself, which basically involved a very inactive and unhealthy eating pattern as a kid, particularly, and was fairly overweight, not very overweight, but fairly overweight for most of my childhood. And then sort of in my late teenage years, I decided I needed to change things, and did what most 18-year-old boys do, which is then suddenly become obsessed with everything they eat, and, you know, spend every waking hour in the gym trying to get, you know, big biceps. And that went on through various different sports and over a few years as an undergrad. And it took me a while to figure out that I actually had a very unhealthy relationship, both with food and with training. And, you know, I did the standard thing of just not eating enough and training too much. And it was having a very dramatic effect on my health and sort of social relationships, because it sort of takes over your life, essentially. And then I went to medical school. You know, I ended up doing a PhD. I spent a couple of years working with patients in hospital. And it's actually surprising that, you know, I have 3 degrees. I spent 10 years in education, and none of those degrees really tell you how to make people feel better, you know, really make people feel better. So did a lot of fixing broken bones and chest compressions during cardiac arrest and all that kind of stuff, which is very good in the acute setting. But, you know, when you're trying to help somebody fix their chronic disease, say, their type 2 diabetes or Alzheimer's disease, you don't really learn anything about that. And it's actually very relevant to athletic performance too. So pretty much what you need to do to make yourself a healthy human being, the basics are very similar, regardless of whether you're an athlete who's trying to perform better or somebody who's trying to reverse chronic disease. And that's a lot of the stuff that we'll cover later on. And, you know, one of the very important tools I think that I discovered along the way, including working with people with multiple sclerosis, I did that for a good period of time and still do, is the ketogenic diet. And then sort of as it gained the popularity, maybe over the last 2 or 3 years particularly, you know, we've spent a lot of time working with people, and we've seen it do, you know, really amazing stuff for a lot of people. But equally, we have become, I guess, because we're vocal about the ketogenic diet. We ran the Keto Summit, or you did all the interviews, and I helped you pick all the guests. And then people come to us, particularly the athletes we work with or people we interact with online, and we hear very frequently that somebody is, felt really good initially on a low carb or ketogenic diet, but then something went wrong. Maybe they couldn't quite fix their metabolic disease. Their fasting insulin didn't come down, or their performance then dropped after they felt good initially, or their sex drive dropped after they felt good initially. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out why the diet either isn't working or was working and stopped working, and that's kind of what we're hoping to cover today, just to sort of help people figure that out themselves and show you how we do it. And we should mention that Amelia, who you mentioned earlier, is collecting questions, or will collect questions as we go. So you can type them in the chat box and she'll collate them, and then she'll ask us at the end. So you can, as you think of questions, you can type those as we go.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to show everyone this because I just think this is so cool. This is a shirt that a mountain biker would wear, and in this case, the mountain biker is Brian Butler, and Brian Butler's now quite a close personal friend. And I've just been away on holiday, I suppose you could call it, because my work life is my passion now. To the Low Carb Breckenridge conference, and you should check those videos out online. They're just coming out one by one. It was a really great conference in Colorado. I really enjoyed it, and I did a little bit of snowboarding, and then I did some training. And while I was away, my wife said to me, "Oh, did you order a new mountain biking shirt?" And I said, "No, I don't think so." She said, "Well, one just arrived for you in the post." And I thought, "Well, that's kind of strange." And she opened the package, and we realized what it was. Brian Butler, my friend, he wrote on this shirt. First of all, I couldn't believe that he'd put my logo, Nourish, Balance, Thrive. You can see it there on the bottom of this shirt. And I don't know if you can read, that's quite small. It says the best here. And it says, "Chris, thank you for changing my life, Brian, CES #1. And CES stands for California Enduro Series. So Brian was the #1 placed athlete in his age group for this mountain bike race. And what I thought was really interesting about this was he put the names of all of the companies that contributed to his victory on this shirt. And he did what I would have done, which is to put the name of the bike manufacturer first on the list of sponsors on the shirt, right? You kind of think that as a mountain biker, that your mountain bike is going to be pretty important if you want to win the race. And as time goes on, it'd be interesting for me to contact Ibis and say, "Hey, did you get a shirt from Brian Butler that said, 'Hey, Ibis, thank you very much for everything you did for me this season'?" And I'm guessing the answer is no. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I'm guessing the answer is no. And the bike that Brian rides, I know it's a very similar bike to the one I ride, and it's at least $8,500, which is the exact cost of the program that we're now running for athletes like Brian. And I think that's the way that you need to think about this as an athlete. It's not healthcare, it's performance, right? Like, this is what you need to do, not just to be the fastest mountain biker in the race, but also to be the mountain biker that's still in the race, right? So I've only been racing for about 5 short years, cyclocross, and then also mountain biking. And I've seen a lot of guys and girls with great talent come and go. And the reason they normally go is because they just don't do well with the racing, right? So they say, "Oh, I race and I win, and then I get sick for 3 weeks, and it's really just not fun. And so, I don't race anymore. That's why I don't do it. Or my back hurts, or my knees hurt, or my feet hurt." And so, that's really what we're doing at Nourish, Balance, Thrive is we're keeping people in the game. It's not just about winning the race. It's about keeping people involved in their passion. So we're going to do this short presentation, and then I've got a special offer for you if you are interested in joining our elite performance program. Okay, so we made some bold statements when we put up the registration page for this webinar, and so I think it's only fair that we answer some of those questions that we posed quite provocatively. And I think, Tommy, you could do a really good job here in answering this question of which athletes are at the highest risk of getting the worst performance on keto and why.
Yeah, I think this is something, this list has kind of expanded the more we work with people, and you can kind of see it there. Some of the ones that we see most commonly, CrossFit and obstacle course racing, particularly, some of the shorter obstacle course races are going to include a lot of sprinting, a lot of sort of what we call glycolytic work, so that middle distance, maybe sort of 1 to 3 or 4 minutes, where you're working really hard and using up the stored glycogen that you have in the muscles. And it's very similar in CrossFit, particularly if you're doing like a longer Metcon, for those people who do CrossFit. And similarly, people who do something like soccer. So if you're doing repeated sprinting, often, and some of those training sessions will maybe last, hours at a time. So we can often see people whose performance decreases there. And, this is largely because for those sports, you do need some kind of glycolytic, or you need some glucose there to supply that. To supply that event or supply the work that you're doing. So particularly when people are doing that repeatedly, or long sessions over a long period of time, then we tend to see a decrease in performance there. We've also worked with some people who do figure skating, and again, that's going to be sprinting on ice, jumping, landing. Again, it can be a very sort of intense glycolytic sport. And like Chris said, cyclocross, and I know that I worked very hard with him to reintroduce some carbohydrates, and I don't think it had a negative effect. I'm pretty sure it had a beneficial effect, even if he'll deny that sometimes. And I think the easy way to look at it is this sort of the volume, right? It's the intensity times the duration. And even in people who are doing very long distance endurance work, so running for many, many hours, there is actually a possibility that even then carbohydrates will become rate limiting, and not because you're using the carbs as an energy source. It's because you need them essentially to keep the Krebs cycle ticking over. That's where you're getting most of the energy from for your aerobic work. It definitely over longer periods of time, even then the carbohydrate sources can become rate limiting, and you sort of take something along the way. So looking at the type of sport that you're doing, and if you have those really longer periods of higher intensity work, then what we see is often people feel good to begin with. The cognitive benefits of a ketogenic diet are often quite noticeable. But then if you sort of repeatedly do that and you're never refueling correctly over time, then we start to see a decrease in performance, decrease in thyroid function, decrease in sex hormones and things, and we'll show you some examples of that. And then that's when you maybe need to think about other fueling strategies, and maybe mixing up some periods of low carbohydrate with refueling with carbohydrates to try and get some of that performance back, but also get the best of both worlds.
I think of keto now as like a special power up, a special power that I have that I can tap into whenever I want to. And that's really, really nice. Back in 2012, I said I was hooked on the maltodextrin gels. And at that time, I was highly metabolically inflexible, right? All I could access was glucose. And then I went through this 2-year period where all I was eating was fat and only vegetables, no real accessible carbohydrates at all, no starch, no fruit, no sugar, no nothing. And I feel like I made myself metabolically inflexible in the other direction, right? And, that didn't work out too well for cyclocross. So for people who don't know what cyclocross is, it's a combination of riding your bike at maximum intensity because the race is only an hour long. And then you get off your bike and you might run up a really steep, muddy hill or something. It's not too muddy in Northern California because it doesn't rain here much, but you get the idea. It's highly glycolytic. So you're tapping into sugar reserves a lot of the time. And so the ketogenic diet is just not optimal for that. So if your goal is performance, then you have to consume some carbohydrates in order to be competitive, I think. Okay. So I thought we might just dive straight into a case study. And Ryan is someone who's been on my podcast and spoken about everything that I'm about to talk about in public. So, I know he doesn't mind talking about this stuff, and people generally don't. In fact, one of the most common paths that I see for people who have been through our program is they take so much of an interest that they start to learn biochemistry and maybe do some training for themselves. And we have several people that have now changed careers based on what they've learned through working with us. And of course, I'm one of those people, right? It's like it leads you away from computer programming into a life full of full of passion. And Ryan is also a computer programmer, and I think he loves what he does as a computer programmer even more. So maybe that won't happen for him. But we share a lot in common, Ryan and me. He went to his primary care doctor, and the primary care doctor was just really not interested in what was going wrong for him. But Ryan was different from me because he was engaging in a completely different type of sport. Where I'm doing these long, slow distance mountain and road bike rides, Ryan is doing this obstacle course racing. And I think most people listening to this will know what obstacle course racing is. And I can't even imagine what kind of suffering this is. I think this image tells you everything you need to know, really. So it's basically an army assault course, only you're doing it against the clock with hundreds of people surrounding you. It sounds completely bonkers to me. And I think it must be one of those things that you really have to do it to understand what the appeal. But Ryan had been listening to a lot of podcasts, and he'd read a couple of books that talked about the benefits of eating a ketogenic diet. And he said, this is really great. And, I'm going to do this. And he started restricting carbohydrates to, say, less than 50 grams a day. And he did achieve ketosis, as you can see here with these numbers. 48 milligrams per deciliter blood glucose is incredibly low. And his ketones were also up 1.2 millimole. I think anyone would consider that to be nutritional ketosis. So, many people in the space might say, well, mission accomplished. You're doing great, Ryan. But the problem was, Ryan was not doing great, right? Here are his main complaints: low sex drive, trouble sleeping, food cravings. And these are very, very typical of the complaints that we hear from the athletes that come into our elite performance program. And here we're seeing some of Ryan's results. So here's how you avoid this trap of doing the ketogenic diet in the wrong way or at the right time. Is you come to us and we guide you through it. And we're not just going to take guesses. We're going to work using our previous experience working with other athletes. And then also we're going to do these sophisticated tests, so blood and urine and stool. And we're going to look inside of your body and see what's going on. And as you can see here from this diagram, some interesting things were happening with Ryan's adrenal hormones. So there's this very important hormone, which is the primary hormone of the stress response, called cortisol. And what this test is doing is it's mapping out your cortisol production over a day. So cortisol is an interesting hormone that it follows this diurnal rhythm where it starts off quite low, in first thing in the morning when you get up, and there's this thing called the cortisol awakening response. Your cortisol should rise like this up to a peak, and then it should gradually taper off overnight, and then it's its lowest overnight when you're asleep. And you can see that's not the case here for Ryan. So can you talk a bit about circadian rhythm and why this might be important, Tommy?
Yeah. So so people will have heard of circadian rhythm, probably. That's just essentially the rhythm over the normal 24-hour clock that your body follows. And most of your hormones have some degree of a diurnal rhythm, so they change over the day, and that's regulated mainly in the brain, but also peripherally in the tissues. So particularly the liver has a lot of genes that are regulated by the time of day and regulated by how and when you eat. And that basically determines how your metabolism runs over the day. And one thing about cortisol particularly is that it's very stimulating. So when you give somebody exogenous cortisol, so say you had a patient in hospital and you give them cortisol, it's actually really important, or some kind of analog of cortisol, like dexamethasone or something. It's really important not to give it at night because actually it will keep them awake all night. It's very stimulating. But equally, it's also increased when you are stimulated. So if for whatever reason you are unable to get rest at night, so I think there were a number of reasons why Ryan in particular wasn't getting the best rest at night. I think he had a newborn baby and a few other things, but also people who are stressed and maybe watching TV late at night too will keep their cortisol high or will elevate.
Or doing this.
Yeah. If you're awake at 2 o'clock in the morning watching this, then your cortisol is probably higher than you want it to be. And so if any stresses at night that are then causing your cortisol to rise, or anything that's keeping you awake, will make your cortisol be higher. And that's also has a sort of like a feed forward effect, and it's going to keep you awake too. And that's, it's really important to have your body's set up to have the rhythms at the right time. So then that's gonna cause problems later on when your energy crashes because you didn't sleep properly, and you're coming down from a much higher cortisol peak earlier in the day. And where we often see issues with people is that they're changing the diet and they're taking some supplements, and these other things like making sure they're sleeping properly, making sure they're getting exposed to light at the right time of day, making sure they're not winding down in the evening so that they can get to sleep and they can bring those cortisol levels down. That's where we really need to work with people, because then that's what makes the diet and things like that work much better. And you'll see from the other side of this, Chris can point to it, the dials. So particularly the two dials on the bottom, you have free cortisol there on the left. So that's kind of what counts. That's what your body sees, and that's what does the jobs. And then you have the metabolized cortisol on the right, which is basically a measure of the total amount of cortisol that you're making. And this is kind of a pattern that we'll see over and over again. And in fact, you'll see over and over again in the presentation, is that because of other things that are going on, particularly thyroid function, you'll have a mismatch in terms of those dials. So you'll see that on the left, Ryan's free cortisol was actually very high. And you can see that particularly because it was high overnight, or high, right when he woke up. But the metabolized cortisol was actually in the normal range. And this is because, particularly because of thyroid function, and some other things too. But thyroid function is really important, because if you are hypothyroid, if your thyroid function is low, then you don't metabolize cortisol as well. So that's why he has metabolized cortisol towards the end of the normal range, whereas he has very high free cortisol. So he's not metabolizing all of the cortisol that he has going around. And particularly when somebody is eating a diet that's a mismatch to their stress levels or the type of exercise that they're doing, maybe not eating enough calories or not eating enough of the right foods, then we often see a decrease in thyroid function. And this is obviously what's happening here. So his thyroid function dropped. We saw that, we looked at his TSH and his T3 and his T4 and his free T3 and all his thyroid markers, and we definitely saw he was hypothyroid, probably because of a combination of things, including the diet and the plus the training pattern, and then that's what's causing this mismatch in the cortisol.
And he didn't know this at first, right? He got great results with this in the beginning, and then everything just went downhill and he couldn't explain it. And so he needed someone to go in there and really debug the situation, tell him what's going on, get a readout from these dials, and so you could see what's going on. And I thought this was interesting to point out. One of his main complaints was low libido, and low libido is not directly connected to the amount of testosterone that you have. But I think you would agree, Tommy, at some point your testosterone can be so low that it does have a profound effect on libido. And this is not just low testosterone. This is like single digit testosterone. This is not good, right?
Yeah. So we're not surprised that that Ryan wasn't feeling great at this point. And actually, very similarly, the production of sex hormones is really intimately linked to energy availability. So when you're not having enough energy, or you are stressed past a certain point, then the body basically decides to shut down reproductive function. And one of those things is a low testosterone. And one of my favorite studies actually looking at this is in Army Rangers, where they basically took some guys as a young, healthy, fit guys, and they fed them a low-calorie diet, or they basically underfed them. So it was like 4,000 calories a day when they actually needed 6,000 calories a day. And they were rucking all day, so heavy loads, long periods of times, hiking, and then they were sleeping 4 hours a night. And their testosterone crashed, within days. And you can just imagine that you're the guy who's getting up early in the morning to go and train, eating a ketogenic diet, so then maybe not getting enough calories because your appetite drops. You've also got a young family, you've got a stressful job, and you basically put yourself in exactly the same scenario as those Army Rangers, and then your testosterone is going to crash and you're just going to start to feel bad.
So this is a urine test that Ryan did, and This gets complicated quite fast, as you can see by some of these complicated names. But basically what's going on here, the name in the left-hand column is the name of an organic acid. And an organic acid is just something that can be measured in the urine. And when we measure that, it tells us something about what's going on for Ryan's metabolism. And this top section of the organic acids test is looking at metabolites that are not actually of human origin. They're produced by microbes and specifically bacteria. So hippuric, for example, is produced by several different species of bacteria. And you can see that in his gut, like there's something going on here, right? So less than 241. I know the man that produced this test. His name is Dr. Bill Shaw. He's been on my podcast. I trust him. I think he's done a really good job with these reference ranges. We've seen hundreds and hundreds of these results now. We know when we see a result as high as this, 623, that this person has got something going on in their gut. So, some people might call this bacterial overgrowth. I think this might be a good surrogate marker for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO. And then you can see it's not the only problem that's there. Arabinose is a sugar that's made by a pathogenic species of yeast called Candida. And so you can see there's some degree of Candida overgrowth too. And then perhaps most significantly is this metabolite 4-cresol, which is produced exclusively by a rather nasty species of bacteria called C. diff. And so have you got any thoughts on what might be causing C. diff overgrowth in particular, Tommy?
So what's really interesting about this area is it's obviously expanding very rapidly, right? The gut microbiome and pathogenic gut species are becoming a very hot topic of research. And one of the times we see particularly C. difficile in patients is when they've taken a lot of broad spectrum antibiotics. So C. diff is a bacteria that actually survives or doesn't respond to most broad spectrum antibiotics. And you can kind of select it out if you've taken a lot of antibiotics over time. With a lot of other things, we're now starting to find out that if you have inflammation in the gut, then actually some of the basically the metabolites or some of the byproducts of metabolism that sort of occur in the inflamed setting are really good for selecting out certain bacteria. So the one that's been most heavily studied is E. coli, but also certain types of salmonella. And then they sort of preferentially grow and they outcrowd some of the more beneficial bacteria. And then when you're setting that stuff up, then you've got a scenario where some of the more pathogenic species are going to be able to find a niche. And you see the same thing with yeasts at the same time. So it can either be, so antibiotics are always a big one, but then anything else that's causing any kind of inflammation in the gut can kind of set up a shift, a negative shift in the gut microbiome.
Mm-hmm. So to summarize, Ryan did a urine test and we were able to analyze his gut microbiome to a limited extent. And what we found was a picture of dysbiosis. So before we move on, we better say what Ryan did, right? So Ryan is doing much better now. And he talked about that on my podcast. But part of the solution, I think a big part of the solution was reintroducing some carbs for Ryan. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think that was one of the things we did first. And as well as sort of looking at, treating the gut, looking at the training program and all that kind of stuff. So it's a big picture thing, but, when you're doing that kind of sport and you have a high stress lifestyle, then, reintroducing some carbohydrates timed around training can be really beneficial.
Uh-huh. And then also Ryan took some nutritional supplements. So some of the dysbiosis that we found in his gut, you can take some botanical herbs that will displace some of those bacteria. So for example, the C. difficile, we've had really good results displacing that with a beneficial probiotic called Saccharomyces boulardii. And that works really, really well. And we know that it works because we redo the tests and make sure that the C. diff is gone. So moving on to another athlete now, this is someone else that's been on my podcast. And I know this is Bob is not strictly a keto guy. I should make that clear. But he found me through a podcast called the Fat Black Podcast, which tells you something about his nutritional approach, which I think is sound. The idea of going lower carbohydrates, like lower than what most guys you'll see out there are doing, is a really solid principle. And Bob's a super fast guy. He's now the #1 ranked, USAT ranked athlete in the United States. And his main complaints were just, I mean, fatigue and, bad mood that goes with it. And I know exactly what that's all about because, I've been there and experienced that. And I don't think it's a coincidence that once I fixed myself, once I fixed my gut, once I went through this whole process that we're talking about with these other athletes here, that, I then went on to get married and had a baby and started a new business. I don't think I would have done any of those things had I not gotten to the bottom of some of these problems that we're showing here today. And then Bob also had a lot of inflammation, and that manifested. He actually sent me some pictures of his hands once, and you could actually see the inflammation in his joints. It's really quite painful and not very nice. So again, we're looking at another Dutch result here, and you see the same pattern. So there's a normal amount of cortisol is coming out of Bob's adrenal glands, right? This is all working hunky-dory. And then you see the free cortisol is elevated. So for some reason, he's not clearing it. And what I'm suggesting to you is that reason is that he has a hyperthyroid state. So his liver is just not doing a very good job of metabolizing and clearing out this cortisol. And then you see the net result here over on the left-hand side. His circadian rhythm is nice, right? He has a strong cortisol awakening response. It tapers off nicely, but you can see that the cortisol is pretty high all day long. And so you can see there's this common theme with all of our athletes, and that is that they have something going on in their gut. So you can see that Bob had a protozoan parasite called Blastocystis cystomanis, and it's a slightly controversial parasite. If you look this up on the internet, you'll see people researching its role in health and disease. But the thing that has to happen when you find a bug like this is you have to say, oh, well, is this working for me at this time? And you can see from these other markers, so this is an extract from a different stool test that Bob did. Lysozyme is something that's secreted at the site of inflammation. And then secretory IgA is a measure of immune function in the mucosal lining that lines the GI tract. And so what these two markers are telling you is that there's inflammation in Bob's gut. And then you can also see, do you anything to say to us about some of these critters that are living in Bob's gut here, Tommy?
Yeah, so it basically just shows a greater presence of certain types of bacteria than you'd like, and some of these, and I guess now is as good a time as any to mention it, and we'll have a little bit of information later on. But there are certain types of bacteria, particularly gram-negative bacteria, that create something called endotoxins, which are toxins that live basically in the outer wall of those bacteria. And what those are very good at is inducing inflammation. And when we do inflammation in the lab, in like the research setting, we're trying to learn more about inflammation, we tend to use an extract of those endotoxins. We take the one from E. coli, it's called LPS, lipopolysaccharide. And what you see is particularly some things like Klebsiella. You'll see third one down, Pseudomonas too. They can have an endotoxin that, if it gets across the gut wall, which will happen if your gut is leaky, there's some other inflammation going on, and we certainly know that by looking at Bob's lysozyme result, that can then cause systemic inflammation, which is going to cause problems again in terms of mitochondrial function, in terms of cognitive function particularly as well, and in general his hormone signaling. So even though some of those bacteria definitely can just be in your gut, they're commensals, which means that they're there normally. If they're there sort of out of balance with others, or they're there in greater numbers than we'd like them to be, and there's no sort of other strains of bacteria that can be protective, then they can cause issues.
Yeah, so in summary, Bob, he pooped into a cup, sent that sample to the laboratory. A microbiologist looked at the sample underneath a microscope, and this is the dysbiosis that they found. And of course, there's a happy story. We almost get great results for all our clients, but one of the things I thought was maybe most important for Bob was he being diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is an autoimmune disease, and not horribly elevated. Like I'm sure you can see these numbers much higher in the beginning, but you can see the before and the after result for his antibodies clearly coming down into the normal range. And then for Bob as an age group triathlete, I think this result is super duper important. So hemoglobin is the protein that transports oxygen. And for many athletes, including triathletes, the amount of hemoglobin rate limits their ability to transport oxygen and therefore their exercise performance. And so an increase in hemoglobin, whilst this may not look much, he's gone from the bottom of the standard reference range towards the middle or maybe the top middle of the standard reference range. It doesn't sound like much, but this is going to have a huge impact on his exercise performance. And that has actually been the case. So Bob is back into a phase now where he's added intensity back in and he's using a power meter and he's sending me emails saying, what the heck? Like my power is like crazy compared to what it was last year. And that may not just be the hemoglobin at play there, but certainly I think it's going to be a significant factor. And you can also hear Bob on my podcast as well. He's been on my podcast.
And one other thing that we've been discussing with Bob recently actually is his ability to tolerate carbohydrate loads much better. It seems he's been doing some fasted training, but be able to take in quite a large carbohydrate load after training if it's appropriate, and actually not seeing much of an effect on his blood glucose at all. So he's tolerating that much better, which is probably going to, again, help him in terms of his performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is another, I think, super interesting story where, I just never would have found out about this had I not been in the position that I am today. And, I really don't know anything about figure skating. I don't know what the demands of the sport are, but like many sports, the body composition is really crucial, right? So what you can see here in the diagram is what's called an axle jump. So obviously the skater is becoming airborne here, and the less body fat that you have to drag up to that height, the better your jump is going to be. And so this particular skater that we worked with had a body composition goal for this reason, and had heard about the ketogenic diet as being a powerful tool for weight loss, which it can be. And so she tried it. And as you can see here from this statement, that just everything crashed. So main complaints again, fatigue, headaches and backache, low libido is back there again, rearing its ugly head. It's really not a nice complaint to have. But the aches, that was something that I really noticed as well, was that there seemed to be a disproportionate amount of aching after any kind of workout. You would still be walking around 3 days later and feeling like crap. And it's just not right. Like something else is going on there. So again, back into the adrenal testing here with the urinary cortisol, you see that same pattern again. Like what's going on here? Like this person is producing a lot of cortisol overnight. And then when you see the total metabolized cortisol, you see this, it's really just shut down. And then, moving on to some of our other sex hormones, you can see here progesterone, estradiol, an extremely important hormone for women and men as well, actually. But can you comment here, Tommy? What do you think is going on?
So I think if you look at everything, basically everything's low. So you go back to the total cortisol is low. Right. Almost all of the sex hormones are very low. And this, I think, is particularly common if you've got some kind of systemic issue. So it could happen with chronic inflammation, plus what's happening when you're basically, again, eating a diet that isn't directly or which doesn't support the activity you're doing. So you're doing a very glycolytic sport and then not refueling with carbohydrates at appropriate times. But I think what was particularly going on with this person was there was some stuff in the gut that we found. We know that she was hypothyroid, and that's something that we're still working on. But basically what happens is if you shut down mitochondrial function, and at the same time you have poor signaling, or you're not eating enough, so you're basically telling the body that there aren't enough calories going around, then that combination of factors will decrease pregnenolone production. So you see that at the top there, and that is really reliant on mitochondrial function, which can be shut down as a result of chronic inflammation. But equally, you're going to signal to reduce those, basically as a preservative method if you're not having enough of appropriate calories coming in and not having those fed signals coming in from leptin and insulin. And basically, I think that combination has really shut down the production of pretty much everything.
So again, we see this common theme where, this is really not a good time for this person to try a low carb or ketogenic diet. You can see that this is a newer, fancier test. So there's actually a snippet of a result from 2 different types of tests, 2 different stool samples that were sent to 2 different labs. So we do 2 different stool tests on our program. And the first is a PCR DNA test. And this is a relatively new commercially technology. And you can think of it as being like, the type of technology that a forensic scientist might use at a crime scene versus the traditional stool culture, right, where it's like a microbiologist looking at stuff underneath the microscope. So in the case of the PCR DNA analysis, they found one of the toxins. So they've not found the C. difficile bacteria itself, but rather one of the toxins that it produces. So this is like a surrogate marker or like the smoking gun for the presence of this rather nasty microbe. And I think this result here is maybe as important in what is missing as it, what is nasty here on the right-hand side is present. So, bifidobacteria. Do you want to talk about bifidobacteria and why it's important, Tommy?
Yeah, bifidobacteria is a bacteria that we talk about a lot, actually, because, in every study, it's difficult to isolate from human stool, but some people are managing to do it. And if you look at the animal work, the animal studies that you have at the same time, you see that bifidobacteria is really closely associated with a much healthier gut lining, a much healthier gut microbiome in general. And when those bifidobacteria are missing, then you tend to have a lot of other issues. So maybe you're not able to stop certain bacterial toxins crossing the gut lining. Maybe you're not able to break down histamine properly, so you end up with a histamine intolerance. Any time that you see a lack of bifido, that's really tells us that there's something not good going on in the gut there. At the same time, if you look on the other side, the commensal sort of imbalanced flora, things like Citrobacter, you see a second down. Often we see that associated with some kind of systemic inflammation or inflammation in the gut, particularly because it has an endotoxin that can cause some of those issues there. So the combination of not having some of those protective species, particularly like bifidobacteria, and then having an imbalance of some of the species that can cause some issues, particularly in overgrowth, then that can really sort of set you up for those problems.
Mm-hmm. So the solution here again, we do what I would describe as a 2-phase program, where in the beginning, your garden is full of weeds, all of those bacteria on the right-hand side are maybe not your friends. Maybe you found some other protozoan parasite or something that's definitely unfriendly. And so you have to go through a weeding phase in your garden and maybe take some botanical herbs. And then in some rare cases, we actually refer people out to a primary care doctor who looks at the results and says, oh, look at that, you've got an Amoeba histolytica infection. You should really take some antibiotics for that. And the person does, and they redo the test and the bug is gone. And then you can move on to phase 2, which is the seeding part. And so the long-term solution is to eat a wide variety of vegetables. So go to your local farmer's market, identify something that you don't know what it is, take it home, Google search it, you'll find a recipe within 2 seconds, and then eat it. And then rinse and repeat as many different types of vegetables as you can get your hands on. And then some things like onions seem to be particularly good for many of the microbes that we think to be favorable. And then, of course, you can also take probiotics. So bifidobacteria is a bacteria that you can actually take in a probiotic. Another bold claim that we made on the registration page that we better answer here.
Yeah, so this is, there are a few things that are kind of cropping up in the world of ketogenic diets, and they're increasingly worrying because it's basically now just become a thought process that as long as it doesn't have carbs in it, it's okay to eat, right? And then basically anything's fair game. And then what you end up seeing is a lot of sort of keto junk food. So if you advance the slide, Chris, we have something like an ingredients list. So this is taken from a keto cinnamon bun. And these foods can potentially be important if you're trying to shift somebody who's eating a standard Western diet onto a ketogenic diet for a therapeutic reason. So if you're doing it in conjunction with their oncologist because they have some kind of aggressive form of cancer, then you can kind of understand why these are coming into play. However, if you look at the ingredients there, this is basically just various fillers, some emulsifiers, some refined fats, and the problem is that with these particularly, they're not going to help foster a healthy gut environment, and they basically look like a low carb version of the food that's getting people into trouble all over the Western world. And there's very little nutrition in here. This is really not going to be setting you up for success. And we know particularly that if you're eating refined fats, those are really good. Refined sugars too, but we've probably cut those out on a ketogenic diet. But refined fats are really good at transporting those toxins across the gut wall. So that can come if you're eating, just like a high fat load in one go, particularly liquid fat, it seems to be. But any kind of refined fat is probably going to be causing that problem too. And then you're going to be increasing the systemic inflammation. You're going to be causing those problems that are then going to, alter your ability to produce hormones, alter your ability for your hormones to do their signaling, reduce mitochondrial function, and then that's gonna set you up. So whenever people are coming to us with issues on a ketogenic diet, if these foods are in the diet, then that's one of the first things that we cut out.
And then especially if you have a weight loss goal, this is a product that's been designed by a food scientist for you to overeat it, right? It's a business plan is what this is. And, I saw in the chat box just a few moments ago that somebody mentioned Rob Wolf's new book, Wire to Eat. And about halfway through Stephan Guyenet's book, The Hungry Brain, this is exactly what they're talking about. Yeah, there's no carbs, but they've replaced the carbs with an artificial sweetener and the fat's still there. And so this is a food that's just cheesecake, right? It's low sugar cheesecake, and it's designed to make you eat lots and lots and lots of it. And it comes along with almost zero micronutrition, right? There's no B vitamins, there's no minerals, essential minerals, or anything else that you need in your diet in this food. It's just pure empty calories.
And not to mention, I think this thing is like $9.
Oh, yeah. So it's not exactly. So you could have gone to the farmer's market and bought all of your vegetables for a week for what this thing costs.
Yeah.
And then, okay, so here's another controversial one, Tommy. I'll let you field this because I know a lot of people love their bulletproof coffee.
Yeah, and again, I'm not specifically going after bulletproof because I think there's some really valuable stuff there. However, when you're again experimentally trying to increase the translocation of toxins across the gut wall, the way you do that is by drinking fat. And that's essentially what you're doing with the bulletproof coffee. So if somebody is in good health and they're performing well and they feel good on bulletproof coffee, then they are absolutely welcome to keep doing it. And I welcome them to, and works really well for some people. But, other people, they continuously have disaster pants. They just can't digest that fat and they don't feel good afterwards. And this is almost certainly tied into having poor gut health and then just adding a load of refined fat on top. And again, maybe there's some CLA, some carotenoids, some butyrate if you're having grass-fed butter. However, when, other than that, there's no real nutrition in there. So, you should be focusing on getting your calories from real sort of nutrient-dense foods that are they're gonna support all your other health goals at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, you could say that about this as well, that there's just no micronutrition. And yeah, my favorite breakfast is bone broth with whatever vegetables we had last night and maybe some US wellness meats, organ meat. It's my favorite thing still after all these years. And that's a high fat meal, but it comes with micronutrition.
So there's been a bit of confusion. If you go back to the last slide, Chris.
Yeah.
The list of stuff here is not individual foods that we have an issue with. These are the ingredients for a keto cinnamon bun, which is
you wouldn't believe it, would you? But yeah, this is the I literally copied and pasted this off the website, the product page for this product. These are all of these things are in one product.
Yeah, so we're not like saying that you shouldn't eat cinnamon or you shouldn't have coconut oil or anything like that. It's that when these foods where you basically mixed all this stuff to create a kind of junk food that's just low in carbs, but doesn't have any nutrition in it, then it's going to cause
Yeah.
cause some issues. So it's not that individually those things are necessarily bad. It's just kind of when that stuff is becoming a major part of the diet, then it can definitely cause issues.
Yeah, this is the work of a flavor chemist. So my wife has a master's degree in food science, and she chose. There's basically two options: you become a registered dietitian, or you become a flavor chemist. And she didn't want to do either of those two things because she didn't think that either route would help people. And this is the work of a flavor chemist whose goal it is to get you to overeat this product. Okay, so how to know when your body is actually ready to do a ketogenic diet and when it's not. So I'll let you take this, Tommy.
Yeah. So I think when people are looking at the ketogenic diet, like often there are kind of two broad groups of people. And one group is when you're going to a doctor who's well versed in this stuff, and you have rampant type 2 diabetes, maybe obesity or morbid obesity, and really difficult to control blood sugars. And basically, you just need to do anything just to stop the rot and reverse the disease process and sort of work back towards health. And then, any of those people, you could almost suggest that they go on a ketogenic diet, and people are doing that and seeing great success. Particularly, really early on, getting that early weight loss, getting that early blood sugar control. For those people, it's really important just to do that. And again, with fasting, can have the same benefit. So in that group, if you're working with a doctor to do that, I think that's absolutely a great thing to do.
So the context is key here. I don't want to interrupt you, Tommy, but the context is key, right? So you have to remember this is the elite performance program. We're working with athletes that are doing 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 hours a week of exercise. So we're not talking about the morbidly obese group that Jason Fung, for example, might be working with. It's a very different audience.
Yeah, exactly. So then if you're somebody who's trying to optimize performance, particularly rather than, treat a severe chronic disease, then there's a number of things to take into account. So when you're starting a ketogenic diet, it is an additional stressor. And, in many respects, that can be a good thing. So people might have heard of hormesis, which is basically the process of becoming stronger after being exposed to some kind of insult. So it's basically the body's version of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And early on, a ketogenic diet can be a stressor in that respect. But what it does then is it improves your ability to deal with inflammation. It improves your ability to create antioxidants. So therefore it has an anti-inflammatory effect and can have a lot of benefits there. But early on, it can cause a stress to the body, particularly if you are then going out and doing exercise that would require some kind of high carbohydrate demand. And there is a possibility that you can play with that, but if you're kind of creating a mismatch there and there's a lot of other stressors going on, then your body probably isn't going to be set up well to deal with that. I already mentioned why suddenly going on a high fat diet, if you have poor gut health, can be an issue. And we see that in a lot of people, particularly, we have a self-selected population of high performers, often have some gut issues, and then they suddenly go on a ketogenic diet, and then they're causing those problems with endotoxins and things that we mentioned earlier. So that's one thing to take into account, that sometimes you want to fix the gut first before you go on a ketogenic diet.
Right.
There's a lot of sort of basic environment stuff that we talk about a lot, because we know that they kind of underpin your ability to both perform as well as, say, respond well to something like a ketogenic diet. So somebody who's sleeping well, and often people who don't sleep go on a ketogenic diet and they sleep better, but often we see the opposite, or that somebody isn't sleeping well and they sleep worse, or they still can't sleep well on a ketogenic diet. And again, that sort of stress builds up. Similarly, if you are struggling with training, you already have a lot of fatigue, then you might want to deal with other things first, other stresses first, deal with other health problems first before you go on a ketogenic diet. We talked about, so there's some stomach symptoms of gas, bloating, diarrhea, constipation. All of that can be a suggestion of some things going on in the gut. Again, we'd fix that first before transitioning somebody onto a ketogenic diet. And one of the best ways to kind of look at your overall health, and this works for both men and women, is having a strong and healthy sex drive. That's kind of your body telling you that you are in good shape, there's enough nutrients around, you're well rested, and the world is a good place for you to go and procreate. And if you have that drive, then that's a really good indicator that everything's going well. So, Chris, if you click onto the next slide, this is it's the graph I made for
I like this.
it's a graph I made for a blog post I wrote a couple of years ago now, and it was meant to be for guys actually, but it works for women too. So on the y-axis on the left-hand side, you see a degree of morning glory, which is a nice, useful metric. Waking up ready for action, as you might say, in the morning, and it does track fairly well with testosterone. So if your testosterone drops really low, you tend to lose this, and then as exercise increases, along the x-axis, along the bottom, actually exercise is probably the best or best studied cure or treatment for erectile dysfunction or sexual dysfunction. So if people who aren't exercising or aren't getting any movement, if they increase that, then they often see an increase there. However, your total stresses, including your exercise, including your diet, including everything else that's going on, as that increases, then, as I mentioned earlier, with the multi-stress environment, those army rangers, poor sleep, not enough calories, high exercise load, that's going to cause a dramatic decrease both in your overall health, but also in terms of your sexual function, which is a really nice metric.
I think this kind of sums up Nourish, Balance, Thrive in a nutshell, really, isn't it? We're always striving to be in the zone. Everybody else wants to just say, oh, it's just this one thing, right? They want to reduce the problem down just to a single variable, and it just can't be done. Every single person that we've worked with, it's never just one thing. So sleep, I think it's worth saying something about sleep in particular, because I mean, it's just so important. I talked with Kirk Parsley and also Dan Pardy to a certain extent about sleep on the Keto Summit. And so, go watch those videos again. But this is just coming up with every single person that they do not do well on less than 8 hours of sleep. And so if you're listening to this in Ireland, you've got some catching up to do. I'm sorry. And then the circadian rhythm part, I think, is really important. And that's the most misunderstood thing that I see, is that people are now starting to understand that the invention of electricity was maybe not such a great thing in certain regards, and that artificial light at night may be a problem. And people are installing f.lux on their computer, which you should do. I've got it installed on my computer right now. And maybe they're wearing some blue blocking glasses. And I know that Amelia is wearing her blue blocking glasses right now. She collates your notes in the chat room, which is great. But the thing that the people are missing is the other end of the spectrum, right? So when first thing in the morning, like, think about it. What was the first thing that you did this morning? Did you open your computer and start looking at that? Did you do something else? I don't know. But what we're seeing is not many people are getting outside first thing in the morning. And so that, I think, in general, is going to be really helpful. The more time you spend outdoors and the more exposure to blue light during the day from the sun that you get, the less vulnerable you'll be to the problems associated with artificial light at night. But then there's this important circadian cue when you go out in the morning. It's like telling your brain, okay, it's daytime. And so you almost reset this clock. And that's the piece that I see that's missing from many of the athletes' lives that I work with. And then, of course, I think some of the other things that are listed on this slide, you're already doing. So you've removed your stupid radio alarm clock from your bedroom. I've just been staying in hotels. Every single hotel room had a radio alarm clock I needed to disable. I might put together a hotel sanitizing or hotel I want to get some sleep tonight kit. And it might include a pair of wire snippers to cut the radio alarm clock before you climb into bed. And then, of course, the temperature and how dark your bedroom is could be important. And the best way I know to fix this, so say you're listening to this and you've got terrible insomnia and you consider yourself to be a night owl, the best thing you can do is go camping. And I can almost guarantee that you're going to fix this within about 2 or 3 days. And there's a really nice study from the University of Boulder, if you want to look this up, that this is exactly what they did. They got people to go camping and they reset the circadian rhythm of people that were self-proclaimed night owls and turned them into regular people. It was a really interesting study. Yeah, do you want to talk about some GI symptoms? And especially the FODMAP bit, I think, is really important information for people.
Yeah, so again, people who, athletes are very susceptible to GI upset. And there's a really nice group of papers, sort of review papers, about how different macronutrients can affect gut function in athletes. And basically what the summary is that carbohydrates, protein, and fat can all affect gut function, which basically means that athletes, when they eat, it upsets their gut. And a lot of that is to do with the changes in blood flow in the gut around exercise. So particularly the more intense the exercise, the less blood flow is getting to your gut, and then if you're trying to digest some food in there, then it's gonna sit there and cause issues. But equally, if you then if you have very intense exercise, you can then cause a dramatic increase in blood flow to the gut afterwards. We call that reperfusion. And then that can also cause damage if it happens all in one go. So if you're then doing intense exercise, then throwing a load of food down almost immediately afterwards, you're basically got a gut that's still unhappy after that intense exercise. And then you're trying to force it to do work at the same time. And that's those issues definitely stack up. And if you have a high stress environment, that could be exercise or lifestyle, it can definitely affect your ability to digest foods, produce stomach acid, produce enzymes. And then if you have a lot of undigested food, that's going to cause issues. That's going to be part of, feeding certain, bacterial populations that maybe you don't want around there, but it's also going to be causing some problems in terms of gas and bloating. So what we see in a lot of people is that they have some kind of food allergen. So we often start with an elimination diet, which is the best way, gold standard way to determine food sensitivities. The most common ones are dairy, eggs, soy, and wheat, all grains. So those are definitely the places to start. But the problem is that when you remove things from the diet, it's also really important to reintroduce them. And our goal is always to have people eat as varied a diet as possible over time. So there's a big move now to have low FODMAP diets for athletes. So if people don't know what a FODMAP is, it's a fermentable oligo, di, and monosaccharides and polyols. And they're basically different sugars or types of sugars that exist in plant foods that can then feed certain types of bacteria and cause some of those gut symptoms. However, so if you restrict FODMAPs for a long period of time, then you're never going to be able to tolerate them, because you're never going to be able to foster the gut bacteria that are going to be really good at dealing with them. So long-term dietary restrictions, we see the same thing. If you're removing some foods from the diet, so you go on an autoimmune paleo diet, you remove all those foods and you never reintroduce them, you're much more likely to be intolerant of them in the future. So while it's kind of important for symptom control early on to do something like a low FODMAP diet, reintroducing those foods over time and retraining the gut to deal with those FODMAPs. And it can actually be a slightly painful process, because people who have FODMAP intolerance initially can have some problems. But, if you can sort of force a change in there, then you're going to have a much happier gut over time. So, just because you're restricting something makes you feel better doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't try and reintroduce it later. And that's all kind of in the process of building a really strong gut over time.
I think this is so important. And I have this unique perspective where I'm able to interview lots of people for my podcast, experts, and sometimes it can be really confusing. You've got, one person saying, oh, well, FODMAPs can be a real problem for athletes because they're so vulnerable to GI symptoms, and that they should be restricting FODMAPs. And I've even heard people talking about a new line of food that's going to be all low in FODMAPs specifically for athletes. But on the other hand, you interview somebody's on the cutting edge of gut microbiome research, and they're saying the exact opposite. They're saying these FODMAPs are the exact things that we should be eating more of in order to have a healthy and diverse gut microbiome. And so who's right? And I think that the researcher talking about the gut microbiome is right, and that restricting these FODMAPs is not a long-term plan.
Absolutely.
Talk about the high fat intake around training as well. So we know that athletes could be uniquely vulnerable, and that so pounding a whole bunch of butter down your neck just as you go training might be a bad idea. So can you explain that a bit better?
Yeah, and so we kind of, part of the issue we explained earlier is to do with those endotoxins in the gut. So, refined fat or liquid fat is really good at transporting those, and people who are in a good spot can definitely tolerate that. But when you have had a period of intense exercise, like I talked about, it can in the short term reduce your ability to digest things, and particularly liquid foods can sort of like pass through the gut a lot before the body gets a chance to kind of deal with it appropriately. That's why things like liquid protein shakes, like whey protein shakes, can often cause digestive distress, because basically the protein is getting through the small intestine before you can break it down properly, and then it's getting lower down, and the bugs are kind of feeding on it, and then it's causing those issues.
Right.
So the combination of exercise, plus any kind of dysbiotic gut, plus a high fat intake, particularly if you've had, that return of blood flow after an intense exercise session, adding fat in, then, you're going to have a more permeable gut after exercise. We know that high intensity exercise increases gut permeability, and that's not necessarily an issue for everybody. But if you're then adding something in that's going to cause this influx of toxins across the gut, moving the gut bacteria across the gut wall, if you have a more permeable gut after intense exercise, sort of the combination there has the potential to be really detrimental.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have some openings on our elite performance program. So the easiest way for you to avoid some of the problems that we've been talking about tonight, or if you recognize some of the symptoms that we've been talking about tonight, then the best way for you to get out of that trap is to join our performance program. And we'll talk about now about some of the things you can expect. So the first thing we need to talk about is training volume. And I think this is really important, and it's sport dependent. Do you want to talk a bit more about that, Tommy?
Yeah, so it's just that, going back to what we talked about before, which is making sure that you're fueling appropriate for whatever it is that you're doing. So, if you're somebody who's doing a glycolytic sport, say CrossFit or obstacle course racing, then making sure you're fueling appropriately. But often, hand in hand with that is whether you're training too much. And often we see people who, just want to add more and more and more training to try and get more and more and more performance.
Right.
But, the best coaches that we've seen, the people we work with, and when we work with people, often you're taking stuff out. You're taking out those junk miles. You're taking out some of that gray zone training, where you're basically at threshold for long periods of time, which doesn't do much for your performance, but it's probably not going to be very good for your gut. It's not going to be very good for your nervous system, and it's going to make it much, much harder to recover. So, making sure that you're doing the right kind of training at the right time, and then fueling appropriately for it. If you're an athlete, it's probably going to be one of the first things that you should address, and have somebody objectively look at your training program and see if it's appropriate for you.
Mm-hmm.
But equally, just as like a very small sidestep, is that I've seen a lot of the questions coming in of people saying maybe they're not an athlete, or they're not, competitive in any way. And the elite performance program doesn't mean you need to be an elite athlete. It just means you are somebody who wants to have elite performance, and that could be performance in literally anything. It could be work,
I mean, we should.
Home. We don't just work with high level athletes. We've worked with athletes of all levels, and that's just people who maybe just want to go out, play with their kids, be able to be more functional around the house. Both myself and some of the other people at Nourish Balance Thrive have a lot of experience working with autoimmune diseases. Julia and Amelia are really good at working, particularly with women who are trying to improve their fertility or trying to improve their hormonal health. So, a lot of different people who just want to perform better. It doesn't need to be Ironman, anything that makes you want to perform better, or, these same steps apply for those people.
I really wanted to say something about that, because I've learned so much about it. When I was, back in 2012, I was looking for a doctor that would help me with my performance. That was the only thing I cared about, was getting that pro upgrade. And then once I found the right doctor and the right person to help me through all this, and I did all the testing, I realized with hindsight that the performance on the bike was the least important part, and that I just never would have known that I could have experienced some of these other benefits, like improvements in mood and cognition and sleep and sex drive and motivation to start a business and all these other things. And now when I look back, those are the really important things. Like being able to go out and do a 4-hour ride and then play with my kid in the garden is far more important to me than what position I finish in a cyclocross race. I mean, that's just completely, at age 41, like that idea is somewhat ridiculous to me now. But at the same time, we do fit that bill in that most doctors that you speak to are not going to give a toss about how well you do in your whatever race, or whether or not you want to qualify for Boston. Whereas we absolutely do care about those goals. And Like Tommy said, you could be competitive in any regard. Like maybe your goal is just to stay on the top of your game mentally, so that you're able to start a new business, or you get that next promotion, whatever it is. We don't really care as long as you're motivated. That's what we're really after.
So I actually think that, you can see all the other things there. It's kind of the stuff that we've gone through, sleep and stress, testing blood, urine, and stool. That's, all sort of included as part of the program. Supporting gut health is really important. Looking at how to fuel for your sport, then reintroducing and rebuilding over time is really important, not to just restrict, but then reintroduce. And then obviously you want to retest, see that what we've actually done has caused improvements. But the reason why I kind of raced through that list is because I appreciate the fact that we've been going for more than an hour now, and Amelia has a huge number of questions that we'd like to start answering. So Amelia is going to send us, it's going to send me questions in a different stream. But I think one of the first things that's been asked quite a few times is about the ketogenic diet and LDL cholesterol. And there are a lot of people who appear to be something called hyper responders. So people who, particularly when they eat a lot of fat or switch to a very high a high fat based diet, then their LDL goes up. And this, there's a number of potential reasons for that. So first of all, some people have, one set of results I have here is somebody went ketogenic, and this is a lady, it looks like. Her cholesterol went up to 6.7 millimoles per liter. That's UK units. She's in the UK. That's 259 milligrams per deciliter in US units. And yeah, that's a pretty big jump. However, whether that's actually an issue is one problem. So if you're looking at particularly Caucasian women, the best epidemiological data we have suggests that even up to 300 milligrams per deciliter, having higher LDL cholesterol really actually isn't an issue at all. Doesn't increase overall mortality, which is what we're looking at. If you want to look at the likelihood of you dying correlated with your cholesterol, then the cholesterol doesn't really seem to be causing an issue there. Particularly if cholesterol then goes too low, it also increases your risk of other things like cancer and dementia, particularly. So first of all, you need to ascertain whether that increases LDL is actually a problem. And most people would probably say that if your total cholesterol goes above 300 or your LDL cholesterol goes above 200, then maybe you want to start looking at it. And some of the things that can be causative factors are the type of fat that you're eating. So particularly people who have certain ApoE mutations, so ApoE4 people, they often are more likely to be hyper responders, so their LDL goes up, and they often do better on less saturated fat and more monounsaturated fat. So maybe they're swapping their butter, their coconut oil, and some of their MCT oils, they're swapping those for something like olive oil. And often then you'll see the LDL come down. So getting your ApoE tested is probably a good idea. You can do that through 23andMe. Some of the other things that might then interplay are things like thyroid function. So when your thyroid function drops, and so if somebody goes on a ketogenic diet, often we'll see their thyroid levels decrease, like the T3 will decrease. That's not necessarily an issue because there are certain studies that show that the metabolism hasn't dropped. So we think that they're more sensitive to thyroid hormones. So they're basically just readjusting after the diet. But some other people will definitely see a drop in thyroid function, and often it's to do with just overall undereating. But thyroid is really, really important for LDL cholesterol function and maintaining those levels. So basically activates the LDL receptor, which is what clears LDL from the blood. So if your thyroid hormone drops, then your LDL usually goes up. So if you're undereating, then often via the thyroid, you might see an increase in LDL. So that's definitely something that's worth looking at too. And then there's some other interesting kind of theories on that, and there's a guy called Dave Feltman who people might want to look up. His website is The Cholesterol Code, and actually he's seeing that in hyper responders on a ketogenic diet, the more fat they eat, the lower the LDL cholesterol is. We're not entirely sure what the cause of that is, but if you're somebody who's really into quantitative stuff, then look at that and maybe look at your fat intake and measure your cholesterols and see if you can then tinker with that to get to where you want to be. Oh yeah, and Alice has pointed out that avocado oil is good as a replacement as well as olive oil, and that's absolutely true. Agree. So what other questions have we got? Somebody has said, how do you determine what your carbohydrate baseline should be? That often 50 grams of carbohydrates is mentioned as a way to start. So, and generally I might recommend that somebody eats like half a gram of carbs per lean kilo of body mass, something like that, which sort of depend on size, but 50 grams is a good estimate. And the best way to determine that is, you can track blood glucose, you can track ketones, but it's kind of a bit of a rough science about how do you feel. If you're somebody who has dramatically reduced the amount of carbs in the diet, and so you can give yourself some adaptation time, maybe a few days. You make sure you're getting enough magnesium, salt. Avocados with salt on, great. Bone broths, things like that. If you then still don't feel good, particularly if you're somebody who's doing that kind of activity that we were talking about earlier, some of those glycolytic sports, then you're probably going to need more. If you're somebody who then feels good at the level you're eating, stick with it. So I think that's, the things we talked about still apply. So if you're, sleeping worse, then maybe some low GI type carbohydrates in the evening may help you sleep. If your sexual function drops or your mood worsens, then those are all kind of things that will kind of tell you that maybe what you're eating isn't really ideal for your current scenario. Do you have any other thoughts on that, Chris?
I mean, it's who are you and what are your goals, right?
Yeah.
Every single person is going to be different. And so, how many carbs did Ryan end up eating in the end? Like 150, 250 grams per day?
Yeah, I think he nearly had a heart attack when I told him to eat.
I know. So people, they just keep swinging from one end of the spectrum to the other. So in 2012, I was probably consuming upwards of 800 grams of carbs per day. I'm sure it absolutely must have been. And then, you go to 50 grams per day. And then, of course, everything in the middle seems unappealing. But that probably is what you need to do is somewhere in the middle. But of course, it's going to depend on who you are and what type of training you're doing and what type of training you're doing at that time. So that's going to vary throughout the year too. So you're going to have some sort of periodization of the carbohydrate intake too.
Yeah. And so another kind of, I guess, related question. This is somebody saying that their thyroid and adrenal problems on keto have made their fatigue worse. Are they doing something wrong, or is there any advice of what you can take or to get energy going again without adding carbs? And my immediate question is why? Well, what's stopping you from adding carbs back in? And sort of looking at that. Currently, obviously, don't know other health problems, whether there's a weight loss goal or anything like that. But carbs aren't inherently bad for you, right? Depending on who you are, depending on what your goals are. And often, particularly in women, particularly in premenopausal women, the ketogenic diet just doesn't work out for whatever reason. The body doesn't think that there's enough food available, thinks it's a stressful scenario, and hormone levels decrease, thyroid and adrenal problems, very common. So unless there's an actual reason why carbohydrates can't be reintroduced, then, I definitely think about that. Similarly, if you're looking at, things like thyroid and adrenal problems, you have to go back to all the other stuff we looked at. So, are there any problems with sleep? Are there stressors in your life that are going on at the same time? The quality of your food, and then, gut testing and looking at things like that is going to be really important. Something that happens really quickly on a low carbohydrate diet, or an improvement we see, is if people end up with like a relative carnitine deficiency. So they just can't get those fats into the cells, into the mitochondria to be processed. So often people who really struggle on a low carbohydrate diet, you give them some carnitine and they're, everything just switches back on because they're able to metabolize those fats better. Yeah. So that's something that you could try. But equally, look at those other questions and, are you somebody who should be restricting carbs, or maybe will you find, a better way forwards on more of a balanced, dare I say it, macronutrient profile that looks something more like, a whole foods type paleo diet or similar that can address some of those other problems.
Mm-hmm. Deborah asked an important question, which is how expensive are all these tests? And the answer is expensive. They are expensive. I don't deny that. And I'll show you the full list of tests that we do in year one with our athletes. So we're doing urinary hormones, which is the Dutch test that we showed several times. Organic acid. So that was the test that found overgrowth of bacteria, possibly SIBO, 4-cresulfines, C. diff. Tommy mentioned there a carnitine deficiency. We would find that with the organic acids test. And then we're also looking for non-metal environmental pollutants that we didn't even get time to talk about today. And then, of course, standard blood chemistry. And this would be for the US-based users. We can send you directly to Quest and you can get blood drawn. And then 2 types of stool tests to look for the different types of gut problems that we talked about. And then the program, it includes everything, right? So once you're on board, we're going to look after you and make sure that we guide you through this whole process. So you're not going to fall into any of these pitfalls that we've talked about. All of the consultation, including nutrition consulting with my wife, is included. And then all the follow-up testing. So we have this really cool way of working set up, which I really enjoy, which is you come in the door, we do a set of baseline tests, we find some problems, we fix all of those problems. Sometimes some nutritional supplements are involved. And then we have this meeting of minds where I show you my playbook, all the different things. So it's not just carbohydrate restriction, it's social isolation and it's stress modification and it's getting outside first thing in the morning. So I have this huge playbook that consists of maybe 1,000 different things. And of course, some things are going to be more important for some people than they are others. And then we work in 2-week sprints and you get as many things done as you possibly can or can stand for. And then we redo all of the tests that found a problem in sort of 2 to 4 months time, including the blood chemistry. And we always get results. So I showed you there the reduction of Bob's thyroid antibodies. That's absolutely expected. That happens every time. And this seems to be a powerful motivator for people. And then we know that the program is working, which I think is super cool. And for all you people, how many people are left on it? We've been talking for a very long time, and
yeah.
I appreciate that. And 244 people are still live on this. So what I'm going to do is, this is the price right here. It's $17.47 for the first 2 months, and then it's $500 for each month thereafter for the rest of the year. And I'm going to go into the site settings for this website, and I'm going to adjust it so that I'm going to take a month off the end here. So if you sign up within the next 24 hours, right? So, okay, I'm going to put this back to the same as what it is right now in 24 hours. And I'm going to take off that last setting, that last payment rather. And so you're going to save $500 if you sign up in the next 24 hours. And that's as a thank you for listening to us for all this time.
Yeah, I was just very quickly, I think we've answered most of the questions that come up. I'm sorry if we haven't done that. A couple I can see right now. Paul asks, are you talking about carb content or referring to total carb? So in general, we're talking about net carbs. So that's carbs minus fiber. If you ask Eric Westman about carbs, he says that pharmaceutical grade low carb is looking at total carbs. However, so you start with net carb. I wouldn't let the fiber in plants stop you eating that. So, look at things like sugars and starches mainly. So Tommy asked about vegetarians and fat. Then Chase has actually kindly answered pretty much exactly what I was going to say. So coconut oil, MCT oil, olive oil, avocado oil, nuts and seeds, also great unless you have some sensitivities to those. So those would all be fine. That gives you plenty of leeway. I think that's probably it. Chris, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. I'm just looking through the list of questions. There's so many questions.
So actually, here's another one I missed. This is about night shift workers, which is super, super important. So somebody on a patrol shift from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., then get to bed at sleep at 5 a.m. and try to sleep for 7 to 8 hours, which I know is really difficult, but only work 4 days in a row and then 3 off. Will biorhythms be off and cause difficulty with your 50-gram keto plan? So, I mean, the sad answer is that yes, biorhythms will be off. However, I think that there's two important questions here. It's that how do you feel right now? So do you feel good? Are you performing at work? If so, it's an essential part of work. You're on a patrol, so you're probably some kind of emergency worker or a security or something like that. So, you're doing an important job. It's just an inherent part of the job. And if you can't avoid that for now, then you just have to stick with it and do the best possible that you can. So then minimizing other stresses is going to be really important. So, other stresses in your life, making sure that your diet, other things that you're eating aren't causing issues, making sure that your gut health is good, really kind of ticking all the other boxes as much as you can is going to be really important. And then the night shift is just something you have to deal with. I think people who are on night shifts, you can kind of do some of the opposite stuff that we talk about. So you can try and expose yourself to bright light, so electric light at night when you wake up, and then you can kind of use those blue light blocking glasses when you're trying to get home. During the day, don't drive with them. Well, if it's bright outside, then it's okay. But and then when you get home again, avoid all the screens. Try and make sure you get back to bed okay. So you can kind of flip yourself around. One of the problems is you're doing the swing thing, so kind of flipping back and forth. If you can minimize that as much as possible, then you end up being like a night owl permanently. Again, if you have family and social life, that's really difficult. But I actually once worked with somebody who was a casino inspector, and basically her and her husband, who was also a casino inspector, they were just completely nocturnal. So they never saw daylight, and
oh my God.
But actually they were in pretty good shape because they sort of completely flipped themselves around. So you can also use things like the human charger, light at the right time, sort of wake you up and then prevent being exposed to it at night. So it's not ideal, but again, if you're feeling good, then fine, stick with it. If you're causing issues, look at everything else, and then kind of just do the best you can. I understand it's tricky, and sort of hack all that stuff. Is there anything else, Amelia? You can send me a message if I haven't covered anything else. Is that it? Okay, so somebody's asked about autoimmune stuff. So we've actually done, so I've done quite a lot of work with autoimmune disease. We often start with like autoimmune type protocols in terms of diet. Again, we showed like Bob earlier, his thyroid autoimmunity essentially reversing, in terms of the antibodies, the thyroid function improving. I've worked a lot with people with multiple sclerosis. So those two main.
I mean, me even, right? So I walked like a celiac. I quacked like a celiac. I ended up in hospital having iron infused into me. Never got the diagnosis because nobody put a scope down my neck and saw total villus atrophy, which is severe gut damage. But I'm still. I don't have to have iron infused with me anymore. And if anything, I'm becoming iron overloaded. So I'm pretty sure that mine was an autoimmune case that was turned around pretty rapidly.
And then, another thing people have asked about sort of exogenous ketones, and I think this is actually going to be a
whole other subject, isn't it?
A whole other subject for a future webinar. So, good and bad sides. If you're using them for performance, I think all the other lifestyle stuff is probably going to give you a bigger benefit. So the exogenous ketones seem to give you about a 2% performance benefit. Making sure that you're sleeping properly, recovering properly, eating properly, all that stuff is going to give you a bigger performance benefit.
Yeah, it's going to be the last 2%.
Yeah, so it's it just depends on where you are. They can be expensive. They may help with appetite. So if you're somebody who's struggling with weight loss, then they could be beneficial. But equally, if you ate a very sort of nutrient dense but not calorie dense diet, then you could achieve some of the same effects. So we'll cover that a little bit more, but that's sort of like the highlights.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's probably it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, everyone, for turning up today. I realized that just at the end here that because I'm sharing my screen that nobody can see me. How do I turn that off? I thought I had a degree in this computer science stuff, and I can't.
It's in the top, in the middle.
I can't.
That one.
I can't.
Yeah.
There I am, but only a picture of me. Oh, what the heck? There we go. Hi, everyone. Thank you for listening to us. I really appreciate you. I've got so much gratitude for you all signing up and hearing us today. And, just the response was overwhelming. So no doubt we'll do another one of these webinars and maybe on a completely different topic. So, yeah, please do let us know. Maybe we'll stay on in the chat for just a few more minutes if you wanted to type something into the chat, if you had any more questions or any ideas for future webinars.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all so much. This has been great.
Cool. Thanks, guys.